Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are plunging headfirst into, well, one of the most persistent, frankly cruel, and economically paralyzing issues facing the UK economy. The housing permacrisis. It's a phrase that feels absolutely right for a situation that isn't just stuck. It feels like it's actively spiraling, worsening human misery and really demanding nothing less than some kind of radical, maybe unprecedented intervention.
Yeah, that sense of urgency is completely justified by the numbers. And they are, well, they're overwhelming.
Right.
When we talk about this crisis, we're talking about 1.33 million households right now stuck on local authority waiting lists. That's like a small country's worth of people waiting for stability.
It's staggering.
And maybe even more heartbreakingly, the system is failing so badly that over 164,000 children are currently living in temporary accommodation. Just think about the generational impact of that kind of instability.
It really is staggering.
Yeah.
And, because the severity is finally maybe being recognized across the political spectrum, the targets being set are incredibly ambitious.
Yeah.
They probably should be.
Absolutely.
We've seen major nonprofits like Shelter in Crisis pushing for the sustained commitment. 90,000 new social rent homes every single year for the next decade.
Yeah.
And then you've got the Tony Blair Institute proposing a massive program aiming for 700,000 social rent homes delivered over that same 10-year period. These aren't just big numbers. They kind of represent the required scale, don't they?
They do. And look, these targets are, I think, achievable, but only if we finally face the brutal, unavoidable economic reality that underpins social housing delivery. For years, this debate has been sort of mired in political maneuvering myths.
Right, lots of noise.
Lots of noise. Our mission in this deep dive is really to cut through that and address a critical, fundamental knowledge gap, the true financial economics of actually delivering social rent homes at the scale we need.
Okay, so let's get right to that core challenge then. The one thing that often shocks people outside, specialized finance circles, what's that counterintuitive truth we need to just accept up front?
The core challenge is simple, even if it's politically inconvenient. Social rent homes, the very homes most desperately needed by those 1.33 million households on waiting list, they fundamentally, mathematically do not pay their way.
Right, they just don't.
They generate an income stream, the rent, that's so low that there's a massive unresolvable viability gap between the capital value those assets generate and the total cost needed to develop and own them over time. You cannot innovate this gap away.
Okay.
So our focus today is on quantifying that unavoidable public subsidy required and, crucially, establishing that financial commitment not as some kind of running cost, but as essential social infrastructure investment, like roads or railways.
Okay, social infrastructure. Let's unpack that financial reality then step by step, because when people in politics talk about affordable housing, it often gets used as this kind of blanket term, right? Like it's all the same thing.
Yeah.
But the sources we're looking at, they clearly illustrate there's a distinct hierarchy, a carefully stratified ladder of affordable homes based entirely on the capital value they generate for the owner.
Absolutely. Think of it less as a blanket, more like a financial ladder,
Yeah.
where the steps are defined by the income they can actually generate.
Okay.
At the very bottom, generating the absolute least capital value and therefore requiring the most subsidy, is social rent. That's the bedrock.
Right.
Moving up from there, you get affordable rent, but capped at the local housing allowance, the LHA, which even that is a massive affordability challenge for many people. Then you move into things like intermediate rent, which includes London living rent, discount market rent, another category of affordable rent, uncapped. And then finally, sort of at the top of this subsidized ladder, you find shared ownership.
That distinction feels really crucial. Why does the capital value matter so fundamentally to this viability equation?
Because the cost of actually building the thing, the labor, materials, planning, infrastructure, those costs are broadly similar for all these homes. It doesn't really matter what 10-year label you decide to slap on the front door.
Right. A 3-bed house costs roughly the same to build, whether it's social rent or shared ownership next door.
Exactly. The build costs are pretty much identical. Therefore, if social rent sits right at the bottom in terms of the minimal income stream it legally generates, it just inherently creates the largest financial deficit, the biggest viability gap.
Okay.
And that gap is the unavoidable challenge. That's what has to be filled by subsidy to make the project happen at all.
Okay. This brings us to something pervasive and, frankly, quite a dangerous misconception that seems to derail the political debate quite often. It's the idea that social rent housing, even if it's loss-making in the early years, will somehow eventually pay for itself over a long period. We've all heard that, haven't we? Just be patient. The rent will cover the costs eventually.
Oh, absolutely. And that notion is, well, it's economically naive because it completely ignores the fundamental truth underpinning all finance. Capital is never free.
Right. Money costs money.
Money costs money. The capital you use to build has to be accounted for. Whether you're a private developer, a housing association, or a local council, what we generally call a registered provider, or RP, the capital deployed, carries a real cost.
Okay.
RPs deploy billions, often raised through borrowing, bond issuance, maybe internal surpluses. But it is not free money from the taxpayer's pot. It's money that has a measurable opportunity cost. There's always something else you could do with it.
So if that capital isn't free, what's the financial hurdle? What do these registered providers have to clear just to show that their investment in a social rent scheme is, financially sensible or at least not actively damaging?
They have to generate a sufficient internal rate of return, the IRR. That's the key metric. It needs to be enough to service that cost of capital.
Okay, IRR.
You can think of the IRR as the minimum acceptable interest rate the project needs to generate over its life just to justify the investment, compared to, say, simply leaving the money in the bank or, more accurately, paying down higher interest debt they might already have.
And what sort of rate are we talking about? What's the benchmark?
Our sources indicate that RPs typically target an IRR hurdle of around 5.50%. That benchmark is absolutely vital to understanding the whole problem.
Okay, let's slow down on that 5.5% hurdle for a second. Why 5.5%? What's that benchmarked against? Where did that number come from?
It's benchmarked against their core borrowing cost and what the market expects for this kind of long-term, relatively low-risk but still complex investment. The cost of public and private debt for major infrastructure, well, it's not cheap right now.
No.
If you look at UK 10-year gilt yields, that's the rate the government pays to borrow long-term. They've been trading between, roughly 3.73% and 4.91% recently.
Now, an RP, as a sort of quasi-public body, usually has to borrow at a slight premium, a bit higher than that gilt yield.
Right, they're not quite the government.
Exactly. So therefore, if a project can't clear that 5.50% hurdle rate, it means the RP is effectively losing money on every single social home built, compared to just servicing its existing debt or maybe investing in other essential activities like critical maintenance or fire safety remediation on their existing stock.
This is where the maths, the illustration from the discounted cash flow model, the DCF model, becomes just the devastating kind of unanswerable truth in this debate, isn't it? You can't really argue with a DCF analysis if it's done properly.
Exactly right. The DCF model is really the only honest way to assess long-term financial viability because it accounts for the time value of money.
Okay.
Let's take that payback illusion first. A simple nominal return model, one that ignores inflation and ignores the cost of capital, might suggest that a new social rent development in, let's say, Manchester could achieve payback in about 39 years.
Sounds long, but maybe doable. Right. You inject the cash today, build the homes, and the small monthly rent payments eventually add up to the initial cost. That sounds, on the surface, viable to a layperson, maybe even to some politicians.
But the DCF model forces us to ask that killer question.
Right.
What is the rent payment you receive in year 39 actually worth today, factoring in that 5.5% cost of capital compounding away every single year for nearly 4 decades?
Precisely. And the moment you apply that real cost of capital, the 5.5% IRR hurdle in the discounted cash flow analysis, the whole financial picture just flips entirely. It becomes negative.
Okay.
The DCF shows, quite starkly, that the rent income stream never repays the total development cost over the typical 50-year valuation horizon used for these assets.
Never. Not just takes longer, but actually never.
Never. The income stream is simply too low. It cannot keep pace with the ongoing cost of financing the initial build cost, which is compounding over 5 decades. In fact, the longer the project runs, the bigger the financial hole becomes in today's money terms, the net present value.
Wow. That really is the aha moment here, isn't it? And it needs to sink in. Social rent income isn't just insufficient to pay back the initial build cost in simple cash terms over time.
No.
It is mathematically incapable of even covering the cost of financing that initial build cost over its lifetime. It's like taking out a mortgage on a house where the rent you charge maybe covers the council tax and a bit of maintenance, but it never, ever touches the principal or the interest payments on the loan you took out to buy it.
That's a very good analogy, yes. And this is why the core financial financial truth that comes out of the source material is just irrefutable. You cannot have subsidized housing without subsidy.
It's so obvious when you say it like that.
It does, but it's fundamental. It's a basic truth of the economic model. Social rent housing is, from a purely financial perspective for the provider, a loss leader. It provides massive, absolutely crucial social value, but it yields zero direct financial return to the housing provider unless that initial, unavoidable financial gap is filled externally, by the public purse, essentially.
Okay. So if the subsidy isn't just necessary, but completely unavoidable, we have to move beyond debating the principle, don't we? We have to start talking about the scale.
Yes.
To meet that ambitious target, we mentioned 90,000 social rent homes annually. What is the size of the required commitment? How much subsidy are we actually talking about here? What's the number?
The scale is, well, it's transformational. And we have to be honest about it. The detailed DCF viability model used in this analysis, and remember, this assumed a professional RP investor, a standard 50-year horizon, that crucial 5.50% IRR hurdle, and critically, it already factored in zero land costs.
Zero land costs. Okay, that's a
Very important. Based on that, the model estimates the true annual subsidy needed is approximately $18.83 billion per year, every year, to deliver those 90,000 social rent homes.
Right. $18.83 billion annually. Let's just pause there for a moment, because that number is, well, it's politically radioactive, isn't it? It immediately invites skepticism, pushback from a treasury, or a government worried about the public sector borrowing requirement, the PSBR. How do we even begin to square a number that high with current public spending debates? And what exactly does that figure cover?
That figure is the precise financial gap. It's the net present value of the loss, calculated using professional infrastructure finance standards. It represents the amount of money that has to be injected into the project on day one, up front, to ensure the registered provider doesn't effectively go bankrupt just by taking on the asset.
It makes the deal viable at that 5.5% hurdle.
Exactly. It bridges the gap to viability. Now let's break down that $18.83 billion figure a bit. Let's look at the subsidy needed per unit, assuming the target is roughly a 50-50 split between apartments, typically in ultra-urban settings, and houses, more often in suburban settings.
Okay. Let's start with the apartments then, usually in the highest cost areas, like city centers.
Right. For social rent apartments, the average subsidy required per home across the country is already a staggering $249,312 flat.
Wow. £250,000 per flat.
On average. Now, to show the regional complexity, you have to look at the really high-cost locations, particularly London and the southeast. For a single apartment in, say, the London borough of Lambeth, the required subsidy jumps to nearly £300,000. The figure calculated was $298,924 per person per home.
Just under £300 for one flat.
Yes, and even in outer London boroughs like Barking and Dagenham, which you might think of as less expensive, it's still $271,313 per apartment. This variation just underlines how the funding challenge is intensely geographically sensitive. Costs vary massively.
Okay. And what about the houses, which we assume are generally built in slightly lower cost areas, maybe more suburban settings?
The costs are lower, yes, but still immensely significant. For social rent houses in those suburban type areas, the average subsidy needed is calculated at £169,207 per home.
Still nearly £170,000 per house.
Exactly. So if you take the blended average across that target of 90,000 homes, assuming half are apartments, half are houses, you land at an average subsidy requirement of £209,260 per unit. That is the raw, pure subsidy needed for financial viability before you even consider the land cost.
Right. And this is where the context becomes incredibly stark, isn't it? We have this required average subsidy of over £209,000 per home. Let's compare that to the actual funding mechanisms that have been in place recently. The current UK government commitment, often cited, is $39 billion over 10 years for the overall social and affordable homes program. That works out to about $3.9 billion annually.
Correct. And if you look back at the previous main funding pot, the 2021-2026 Affordable Housing Grant Program, the average subsidy provided per affordable home, and remember, that included higher value tenures like shared ownership, not just social rent.
Right. It wasn't all for the lowest rent home.
Exactly. The average grant under that program was only around £64,000.
$64,000.
So we are comparing a calculated required average subsidy for social rent of £209,260 with a recent average grant across all affordable types of just £64,000.
That's a huge gap.
It's massive. And even that recently announced $3.9 billion annual spend, while it sounds like a large number in isolation, is clearly insufficient. If the analysis shows we need 18.83 billion annually for the 90,000 social rent homes,
Yeah.
then that 3.9 billion represents only about 20% of the calculated necessary annual requirement, just a fifth.
Right, so that immense funding gap, 80% missing that, is the actual cause of the housing shortage at the social end, isn't it? It's not really planning law complexity or skill shortages.
Those are factors. That's right.
The root cause is simply the absence of the necessary capital.
Absolutely. It's the missing subsidy. And this brings us to a major political myth that we really have to debunk immediately. It comes up all the time.
Which is,
Free land is the silver bullet. It's the default response for so many politicians. Commentators just get the government to give away public land cheaply or for free, and the crisis solves itself. Magic.
why does that myth persist so strongly? And why is it, according to this analysis, fundamentally misleading?
Well, it persists because land is a huge component of the overall market price of housing, especially in high-value areas, so it feels intuitive.
Sure.
But it's misleading because the fundamental viability gap for social rent specifically is driven primarily by the extremely low rental income stream compared to the cost of capital, not by the land value itself.
Ah, okay.
And remember, crucially, the $18.83 billion annual subsidy figure we calculated already excludes land costs. We modeled a scenario where the RP gets the land for literally zero costs, assuming it's, say, gifted public sector land.
So let me get this straight. Even if we magically found and gifted every single piece of publicly owned land required for 90,000 homes a year completely free,
Yes.
well, we still have an $18.83 billion annual funding problem just to make the building and owning of those homes financially viable for the RPs.
Precisely. That's the calculation. If registered providers actually had to purchase the land on the open market, or even buy it at a subsidized existing use value, the subsidy requirement would increase substantially way beyond that $18.83 billion baseline.
Wow.
So while land policy is absolutely critical and making public land available is important, it is not the primary driver of the financial deficit for social rent homes. The main driver is that persistent, long-term, unresolvable gap between the minimal rent income and the compounding cost of capital. You're essentially building a vital infrastructure that requires a full upfront subsidy, almost regardless of where the land comes from.
Okay. So we have this clear, unavoidable price tag, nearly $19 billion annually for the 90,000 target. Given this enormous financial gap, we have to look at the tools we currently have and maybe any innovative proposals on the table. Let's start with the mechanism that currently delivers quite a significant chunk of affordable housing in the UK. Section 106 agreements, or S106. How does that work in this context?
Right. S106 is crucial to understand, partly because it's often misunderstood. It's not direct government subsidy in the same way grant funding is. It's a localized planning agreement.
Okay.
Effectively, it functions as a form of land value taxation at source. When a private developer is looking to buy a piece of land for a new housing project, they calculate its residual land value.
Which is?
Which is basically the estimated final sale value of the completed homes minus all their anticipated costs, build costs, finance costs, their required profit margin, and the cost of meeting any planning obligations, including providing affordable housing under S106.
Okay, so the developer essentially factors in the cost of delivering those required affordable homes before they even make an offer to buy the land.
Exactly. They reduce the price they're willing to pay for the land to account for the S106 obligations. So ultimately, who absorbs that cost? It's the original landowner.
The land seller gets less money for their land.
Correct. The potential land value is effectively taxed at the point of sale to fund the affordable housing requirement on that specific site. Our sources show that S106 collected something like £7 billion in this kind of land value taxation fairly recently, with a majority, around 67% of that, allocated towards affordable homes provision. So it's a significant but often kind of hidden source of cross-subsidy from the private market.
But if it's generating billions, why can't we just scale up S106, mandate more of it to meet that $18.83 billion annual need for social rent?
Because S106 has some pretty severe capacity constraints built into it. First, it relies entirely on private market development being financially viable itself. If the housing market slows down or construction costs rocket, private development stalls, and S106 delivery dries up completely, it's pro-cyclical.
Right. It disappears when you need it most.
Pretty much. Second, it simply cannot deliver the sheer scale we're talking about, that consistent 90,000 annual social rent target. The private market just isn't big enough or consistent enough. And perhaps most importantly for this discussion, because social rent has the lowest capital value and therefore creates the biggest viability gap, developers often actively resist building it under S106 if they can.
Why is that?
Because it eats up more of that land value tax they've factored in. They often find it financially much more beneficial to push for shared ownership or maybe intermediate rent homes on their S106 sites because those tenures require less cross-subsidy from the scheme's overall value to clear the viability hurdles.
So S106 tends to favor the less unaffordable end of affordable housing, not the most needed social rent end.
Generally, yes, it's a useful tool for generating some cost subsidy, definitely valuable, but it is absolutely not the mass delivery engine we need specifically for the lowest income bracket for social rent.
That clarifies the limitations of S106 quite well. So that leads us directly to the calls we constantly hear for financial innovation. Buzzwords like using patient capital, long-term institutional funds, or maybe complicated schemes like the old private finance initiatives, PFI, or sale and leaseback models. Can innovation somehow bridge this $19 billion gap?
Yeah, it's fascinating, this constant call for innovation. But what's really striking here is that no innovative financial model, no matter how clever the structuring is or how patient the capital claims to be, can actually bypass the fundamental requirement for an appropriate return on the capital employed.
Still comes back to the cost of money.
It always comes back to the cost of money. Financial innovation can potentially make capital deployment more efficient, maybe streamline processes, but it cannot override the basic risk calculation inherent in the market. It cannot magically create money where the underlying asset, the social rent home, generates a fundamental operating loss compared to its financing cost.
And the market, whether it's pension funds or banks or whoever, dictates that if capital is deployed, it demands compensation. It needs a risk premium over and above the basic risk-free rate.
Absolutely. The market isn't doing this out of charity. If we use, say, the index-linked bond yield, the government's cost of borrowing linked to inflation, currently sitting around 1.75% as our baseline risk-free rate,
Okay.
the market typically demands a spread on top of that, maybe 250 to 350 basis points, so 2.5% to 3.5% added to that 1.75%.
And that spread covers what?
It covers things like liquidity risk, how easily can they get their money back, credit risk, will the RP default,
Okay.
maybe political risk, will a future government change the rules, all those uncertainties. So if the social rent income stream simply doesn't produce an IRR, remember our 5.5% hurdle, that covers both that underlying risk-free rate and that necessary risk premium, then private capital, no matter how patient, simply will not flow in sufficient quantity to fund that core viability gap. You're inevitably left with only one real solution. The subsidy has to ultimately come from public funds, either direct taxation or government borrowing.
Which brings us neatly to a specific, quite tangible alternative mechanism that tries to tackle this scale issue, but maybe without hitting the government's borrowing figures, the PSBR, quite so immediately. That's social housing tax credits, SHTCs. How exactly would this work, and why is it considered promising by some?
Right. SHTCs are essentially a hybrid solution. They've been used successfully in other places, like the U.S. with their low-income housing tax credit, which is a huge program. The idea is to leverage private sector balance sheets to fund the subsidy now, but structure it in a way that doesn't immediately impact the public sector borrowing requirement, the PSBR.
Okay, let's just pause on PSBR for a moment. For our listeners, why is the PSBR basically the amount the public sector needs to borrow each year? Why is that figure so politically sensitive? Why do governments worry about it so much?
Well, it's the headline debt figure, isn't it? Politicians across the spectrum are generally very sensitive to anything that pushes up the national debt figures or requires significant immediate government expenditure, especially in times of tight budgets. SHTCs are designed to kind of sidestep this immediate hit.
How? By structuring the subsidy differently?
Exactly. It structures the subsidy as a future tax expenditure rather than an immediate cash outflow from the Treasury today.
Okay, so how does the money actually move? Who pays what when?
The mechanism typically involves large companies, often financial institutions or corporations with significant tax liabilities. They deploy their own private capital today to fund that subsidy portion needed for social housing development, that £209,000 gap per unit, for example.
Okay, they put the cash in now.
They put the cash in now. In exchange for doing that, they receive a guaranteed future tax relief from the government. Essentially, they are paying their future corporation tax bill early or upfront by investing in social housing today, and they receive a predetermined discount or credit against that future tax liability for having provided the capital now.
So it's like a prepayment of tax, but directed into housing subsidy.
That's a good way to think of it, yes. And this tax credit is often designed to be tradable, so investors who maybe don't have enough tax liability can sell the credit to others who do, creating a market.
So let me summarize. The government gets the capital immediately for the housing subsidy, so housing gets built now, which is the goal. The companies providing the capital get a guaranteed future tax benefit, effectively a discount on their tax bill later. And crucially, this doesn't increase the national debt or the PSBR this year. That sounds, well, genuinely additive, potentially.
It is, provided, and this is a crucial caveat, provided it is managed correctly and transparently. It does raise immediate capital for the subsidy without increasing today's PSBR figure, which is politically attractive. And proponents argue it's largely self-funding in the medium to long term precisely because of the massive social and economic savings generated by building the housing itself.
Right, the savings will come on to.
Exactly. But crucially, SHTCs must be structured very carefully to ensure additionality. Meaning they must genuinely fund projects that absolutely would not have occurred otherwise. They shouldn't just substitute for funding that might have happened anyway or crowd out existing private investment. Every pound of tax credit generated must deliver a genuinely new additional home that wouldn't exist without it. That's key to its efficiency.
But hang on, if SHTCs work by deferring tax revenue, the government gets less corporation tax later because it's given these credits away. Aren't we just, kicking the can down the road? Aren't we risking the stability of the PSBR just further out?
That is absolutely the necessary scrutiny. Yes, it does defer tax revenue. The entire argument for SHTCs rests completely on the premise that the financial benefits generated by building that house today, things like reducing welfare bills, cutting NHS costs from better health, boosting construction jobs and GDP, that these benefits accrue quickly and significantly outweigh the value of the deferred tax revenue over a relatively short period.
So it's an investment calculation again?
It's entirely an investment calculation. It's an acknowledgement baked into the policy that funding social infrastructure today delivers tangible savings tomorrow, making the deferral of tax income economically worthwhile. It effectively forces the government and the market to treat the initial subsidy not as a sunk cost, but as a net zero or even net positive investment over maybe a 10 to 15-year time horizon.
Okay. This shift in perspective feels like perhaps the most important takeaway from all the source material we've looked at.
I think it is.
When you're confronted with an annual need of nearly 19 billion pounds, it is just so easy for policymakers, for the media, for the public to frame this purely as a colossal expenditure, a massive financial burden on the taxpayer. But what this analysis demands is that we aggressively shift that framing, move away from cost and towards investment. If the RPs, the housing providers, aren't seeing a direct financial return on that subsidy, where exactly does the value accrue? Who gets the payback?
The financial returns accrue directly, demonstrably, and almost immediately to the Exchequer, to HM Treasury, and then ripple out across the whole of society. This isn't about philanthropy. The argument is that this is high-impact preventative spending that delivers an immediate and ongoing return on investment, primarily by eliminating other, far more expensive, current government expenditures.
Okay, let's start with the most dramatic, maybe the most visceral example of that wasted public money, the absolutely ever-spiraling cost of temporary accommodation, TA.
Yeah, this is where the false economy of non-investing becomes just incredibly clear. Local councils in the UK spent a staggering £2.8 billion purely on temporary accommodation for homeless households in the single financial year 2023-24.
$2.8 billion.
Yeah.
In 1 year.
In 1 year. That is a gargantuan annual recurring cost. It's like a permanent, unavoidable leak from the public purse, often funding housing that is substandard, insecure, damaging to health, just completely inappropriate, especially for families with children.
So what could that $2.8 billion do if it weren't being spent essentially on managing failure? If it were instead used as, say, the interest payment on a long-term infrastructure investment?
Well, the comparison made in the analysis really reveals the colossal opportunity cost here. If that annual $2.8 billion expenditure were instead used to service the interest payments on government borrowing using index-linked gilts, let's say, at their current low real yield of around 1.75%,
Okay.
that $2.8 billion annual payment stream could theoretically service the interest on government bonds worth approximately $160 billion in perpetuity.
Wow. $160 billion. Let's just unpack that number. That means the money we are currently effectively throwing away each year on temporary fixes, on sticking plasters, has the underlying financial capacity to underpin a government borrowing program large enough to deliver a lifetime of stable, decent housing for hundreds of thousands of people.
Exactly that. That 160 billion of theoretical borrowing capacity, serviced by the current TA spend, is enough to theoretically subsidize around 765,000 social rent homes based on that average per unit subsidy cost, 209K we calculated earlier.
765,000 homes.
The sheer fact that the UK is currently spending 2.8 billion a year to manage homelessness rather than leveraging that same financial capacity to actually solve it by building permanent homes is possibly the deepest indictment of current housing policy failure.
So the sources suggest a much more targeted approach is possible, almost like a direct swap of that wasteful cost for productive infrastructure.
Yes, exactly. The argument is made quite compellingly that a dedicated one-off subsidy injection of approximately 27.2 billion would be enough capital to build roughly 130,000 new social rent homes.
Okay.
Now, if those 130,000 homes were strategically prioritized for the specific families and individuals currently trapped in that expensive temporary accommodation system,
Yeah.
it could, at least on paper, reduce that annual 2.8 billion TA bill effectively to zero within just a few years of the construction being completed and people moving in.
So the Treasury saves $2.8 billion every single year going forward, which immediately starts generating a massive return against that initial $27.2 billion investment. That seems like a no-brainer.
It does from a purely fiscal perspective, but the benefits obviously extend much, much wider than just cutting the TA bill, as huge as that is. The Center for Economics and Business Research, CEBR, did a report looking at this, highlighting the compounding systemic indirect returns.
These are the benefits that flow back to the taxpayer and society, not necessarily directly to the RP that owns the home.
Precisely. These are the societal dividends. The massive indirect returns include things like significantly reduced welfare dependency, fewer people needing housing benefit, or the housing element of universal credit to try and bridge the gap between their low income and extortionate private market rents.
Makes sense.
Secure housing leads to massive job creation and economic impact, just from the sheer scale of the construction effort needed. Building 90,000 homes annually is estimated by CEBR to have a total economic impact of something like 48.2 billion, rippling through the construction supply chain, materials, and then into long-term property management jobs.
And then there are the fundamental social benefits.
Yeah.
The ones that are maybe notoriously difficult to put a precise pound sign on, but arguably provide the most profound systemic change for people's lives and for society.
Absolutely crucial. Secure, warm, stable housing leads directly to demonstrably improved physical and mental health outcomes. That drastically reduces the burden and cost for the NHS over the long term. Having a stable address means hugely improved educational attainment and life chances for children growing up in those homes. It enhances social cohesion in communities, potentially reduces crime rates associated with poverty and instability. The CEBR report tried to quantify some of this, concluding that the net positive impact purely on the exchequer finances over 30 years could be around 11.9 billion, with the Treasury reaching its own break-even point on the initial investment in about 11 years following construction completion.
Okay, now, let's be critical here for a moment. That 11-year payback for the government sounds incredible, almost too good to be true. We have to acknowledge the critique check here. Was that CEBR analysis perhaps done in a slightly different economic climate? Maybe slightly too optimistic, given the financial shocks we've seen in recent years with inflation and interest rates?
That's very necessary skepticism, yes. The CEBR analysis was robust for its time, but it inevitably relied on certain economic parameters that have shifted significantly since it was published.
Like what?
Well, firstly, they likely underestimated the true required subsidy per home. Their model used around £196,000 per home, whereas our updated analysis, reflecting higher costs and interest rates, puts it closer to that £209,000 figure. So the upfront cost is higher.
Okay.
And perhaps even more crucially, they used a significantly lower discount rate in their calculations, 3.5%, which was the standard government Green Book rate at the time.
Compared to the 5.5% IRR hurdle rate we've established, the market actually requires now.
Exactly. And why does that difference in the discount rate, 3.5% versus 5.5%, matter so much for calculating payback?
Because a higher discount rate drastically reduces the net present value of those future savings.
Right.
Like, benefits received further in the future are worth less in today's money if you discount them more heavily.
Precisely. If you apply the current higher 5.5% discount rate needed for viability, the calculated value of those future welfare savings, NHS savings, economic benefits, it's all reduced in today's money terms. This means the actual payback period purely for the exchequer is likely somewhat longer than that estimated 11 years, maybe closer to 15 years, perhaps even 20 years in some scenarios.
So the payback takes longer, but it still happens.
Yes, the fundamental principle remains absolutely sound. The investment still generates substantial, quantifiable financial and social returns for the UK government and wider society that demonstrably outweigh the initial expenditure over the medium term. It is an investment with a guaranteed massive societal return, even if the precise timeline shifts a bit with economic conditions.
Right. The investment case itself holds firm.
It does.
Okay, so the investment case is clear. The money spent comes back to the state and society in multiple ways.
Oh.
But as you said, simply authorizing a check for nearly $19 billion annually isn't enough on its own.
No.
We need smart strategic policy reforms alongside that funding commitment to ensure this massive investment is actually efficient, sustainable, and delivers the maximum possible value in the long term.
Absolutely essential. You can't just throw money at it.
So what's the first step in ensuring that efficiency, particularly thinking about the construction sector's capacity to actually deliver?
Well, first and foremost is the counter-cyclical timing of the investment. This is crucial. If the government suddenly announces $19 billion worth of new building work literally overnight, the construction industry will simply be overwhelmed.
Right. Not enough builders, materials costs shoot up.
Exactly. Supply chains will buckle under the strain, labor costs will inflate rapidly, and you'll end up delivering far fewer than the target 90,000 homes for the money spent. It becomes inefficient.
So what's the alternative?
The government needs to use a stable, predictable, long-term pipeline of funding a guaranteed commitment over, say, 10 or even 20 years. That stability allows the industry itself to invest confidently in skills, in training apprentices, in adopting modern methods of construction, or MMC, which can improve speed and quality.
So using this massive public funding stream strategically, almost to smooth out the typical boom and bust cycles we see in private residential development, acting as a kind of economic stabilizer for construction.
That's exactly the idea. It uses the state's unique capacity for long-term commitment to build resilience and productivity into the construction sector itself. That's the first thing. Second, and this is absolutely vital for the delivery agents, the RPs, registered providers need more than just a clear rent settlement going forward. Many of them desperately require significant recapitalization just to be in a position to deliver at scale.
Recapitalization.
Yeah.
Tell us more about that squeeze they're in. What are they facing beyond just the higher interest rates we've discussed?
Well, RPs are currently caught in a massive financial pincer movement. They're dealing with astronomical, often unbudgeted costs associated with huge building safety remediation requirements, particularly following the Grenfell tragedy and subsequent legislative changes around fire safety, cladding removal, etc.
Right, huge costs there.
Huge, unpredictable costs. And on top of that, they face the immense long-term, legally mandated costs of transitioning their entire existing housing stock, millions of homes, to meet the UK's net zero carbon targets by 2050. Decarbonization is another massive looming bill.
So they're being hit by legacy safety costs and future environmental costs simultaneously.
Exactly. They simply cannot be the reliable engines of mass new build delivery if their existing balance sheets are already creaking or even collapsing under the sheer weight of these external regulatory and safety-driven costs. They need specific financial injections for resilience, for improving their existing stock, alongside the subsidy for new builds. It's a two-pronged challenge.
And what about the housing stock we already have? It seems completely counterproductive, almost insane, to be losing thousands of social homes through things like right to buy, while simultaneously trying to spend billions building new ones.
It is fundamentally counterproductive, and that leads directly to the very strong argument for significant right-to-buy RTB reform or even abolition.
Abolition, that's radical.
Well, given the sheer scale and severity of the current crisis, our sources suggest there is a compelling ethical and certainly economic case for the complete abolition of RTB, at least for a significant period.
Why economics?
Because for every social home sold through RTB, often at a huge discount, the government effectively has to find the subsidy, remember, £209,000 on average, to fund the construction of a brand new replacement home, which usually costs far, far more than the cash receipt from the sale. It's an incredibly inefficient use of public funds and a constant drain on this critical social asset base we desperately need to grow, not shrink.
So if not abolition, what's the minimum reform needed?
At the very least, maintaining the relatively new rule that properties cannot be sold until the tenant has been there for a much longer period. Perhaps the 35 years mentioned in some proposals is essential to slow the losses. But the fundamental maths of RTB in a housing crisis just don't stack up anymore.
Okay, let's pivot slightly to maximizing the potential from the homes themselves once they're built and occupied. Can we make the system work better financially without compromising that core principle of affordability for tenants?
This is where we should seriously consider innovative approaches like flex rent models.
Flex rent, how does that work?
The idea is to move away from fixed rents, set way below market levels for everyone, regardless of their income trajectory. Instead, you dynamically adjust the rent payable based on the tenant household's actual verified income over time.
How would you verify that?
You could potentially leverage up-to-date anonymized data linkages with systems like HMRC, the tax authority. The approach would maintain genuine deep affordability for those households truly struggling, ensuring they never pay more than a defined, manageable percentage of their actual income, say 30%.
Okay, so the safety net remains strong for the lowest earners.
Absolutely essential. But, crucially, it would simultaneously allow rents to rise, perhaps still capped below market levels, but higher than traditional social rent for those households whose incomes significantly improve over their tenancy.
And that additional rental income generated from tenants who can now afford to pay a bit more, what happens to that?
It creates a vital internal reinvestment fund for the registered provider. That higher revenue stream doesn't go to shareholders. It gets plowed straight back into maintaining the existing housing stock to a high standard, or potentially used to directly cross-subsidize the building of new social homes, or support those tenants on the absolute lowest incomes even further.
So it reduces the reliance on external subsidy over time.
Potentially, yes. And it could also lead to a reduction in the overall housing benefit bill for the government, another direct saving for the Treasury, as fewer tenants would need state support to cover their rent if the rent itself flexes with their ability to pay. It arguably makes the system fairer, more dynamic, and more financially self-sustaining across the diverse economic spectrum of tenants who rely on social housing.
Interesting. And finally, there was a recommendation for a small but apparently critical technical change needed for that S106 system we discussed earlier to ensure it delivers maximum efficiency when it is used.
Yes, this is about avoiding perverse incentives in the current system. The recommendation is to fix the value of the affordable housing being delivered via S106 using an agreed, transparent formula right at the planning permission stage.
Why is that needed? What's wrong now?
Currently, what can happen is that private developers build the S106 units, and then multiple publicly funded housing associations effectively end up bidding against each other to buy those completed units off the developer.
Creating an artificial market.
Exactly. This bidding process can inflate the price the developer receives, meaning public subsidy intended for affordable housing ends up unnecessarily boosting the private developer's profit margin on that specific part of the site.
Right. Public money leaking out.
Precisely. By fixing the transfer value, using a clear, agreed formula upfront, based perhaps on build costs plus a reasonable fixed margin, it removes that perverse incentive for RPs to overbid. It improves market efficiency and predictability for everyone, and it ensures that the land value taxation mechanism inherent in S106 is fair, transparent, and cannot be easily gamed. It makes the whole process cleaner.
Okay, so bringing all these threads together, this entire deep dive, really guided by the cold, hard maths of discounted cash flow analysis and the realities of capital costs, seems to bring us back relentlessly to one core, almost stark, unavoidable conclusion.
I think it does. The conclusion is that the only viable solution to delivering social rent housing at the scale needed requires public subsidy at a truly transformational, almost post-war level. We are talking about the state needing to commit a non-negotiable $18.83 billion or something very close to it annually just to hit those widely agreed targets like 90,000 homes a year.
And framing that not as optional spending, but
as essential, unavoidable capital investment in a foundational piece of national social infrastructure. It's not a nice to have, it's fundamental.
It really is shifting the narrative entirely, isn't it?
Right.
We're not just discussing housing policy in isolation anymore. We're discussing a necessary long-term investment in our core social infrastructure, primarily to maintain social stability, boost economic efficiency, and, frankly, reduce other massive public costs.
That's the argument in a nutshell,
Yeah.
Yes.
So let's end then with that powerful, quite arresting message that was articulated so clearly in our source material. A message that really reframes the entire mission of social housing, not just for individuals, but for the UK economy as a whole. Social rent homes are not for people in need. Social rent homes are for people we need.
It's a powerful reframe. And that reframing, that explicit acknowledgement of social housing, not as a welfare cost, but as a strategic national asset that benefits everyone, leaves us with one final, perhaps provocative thought for listeners to really consider. The critical question facing the UK right now is not really whether it can possibly afford the $18.83 billion annual investment needed to deliver social housing at the scale required. The real, urgent, and increasingly painful question, especially when you look at that spiraling $2.8 billion annual temporary accommodation bill and the clear erosion of social stability and economic productivity caused by the housing crisis. The real question is whether the UK can possibly afford the rapidly escalating financial and social costs that result from delaying this investment any longer. Delaying the investment doesn't save money, it simply compounds the crisis, making the eventual bill far, far larger and the human cost unbearable.